The dust storm that greeted our well-digger upon his arrival in Red Clay Valley seemed less like weather and more like the land's way of testing newcomers. Late June of 1894 had been particularly unforgiving to the Oklahoma Territory, and the man who stepped down from the freight wagon that afternoon looked like he'd been carved from the same dried earth that swirled around him. 42 years had etched themselves into his face through sun lines and weather creases, each one earned through decades of reading the land's hidden messages. He paid the freight driver 2 bits, hefted his worn leather satchel and wooden tool case, and squinted through the amber haze toward what passed for the main street. Red Clay Valley spread before him like a half-finished thought. Buildings scattered with the randomness of dice thrown by a careless hand. Some proper timber constructions, others mere dugouts with ambitious false fronts. The settlement had that peculiar quality of frontier towns, simultaneously ancient and newborn, as if the land itself couldn't decide whether to embrace or reject these human intrusions. Morrison's General Store stood out by virtue of actually having glass windows, though they were now opaque with dust. The well-digger pushed through the door, causing a brass bell to announce his arrival with surprising clarity. The interior offered blessed relief from the wind, though dust motes continued their lazy dance in the shafts of filtered light. Behind the counter stood a woman whose sharp eyes suggested she'd already catalogued everything about him worth knowing. "Passing through or staying?" Clara Morrison didn't waste words on pleasantries. Her hands continued sorting mail into cubby holes while she studied him. "Depends on the work," he replied, setting down his tools with the careful precision of a man who knew their value. "I dig wells." "Divine water, some say, though between you and me, ma'am, it's more about reading rock than reading Providence." This earned him something that might have been approval in the slight adjustment of her expression. She was 46, he guessed, maybe 47, with that particular brand of frontier toughness that made exact ages irrelevant. "Wells, you say? Well, you'll find no shortage of desperate farmers hereabouts, though if you're planning to work the Hartley place, you might want to reconsider." The well-digger had learned long ago that the best information came from letting others fill the silence. He moved to examine a display of canned goods, running his finger along a shelf that hadn't seen a dust cloth in days. 3 wells in 2 years, Clara continued, warming to her subject. "Each one dried up within a month. The Cherokee say that land's cursed. Poisoned by greed, old Joseph Two Rivers calls it." "Samuel Hartley's too stubborn to listen. Keeps throwing good money after bad." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. The well-digger noted how the building creaked but held firm. Good construction, built to last. He'd seen too many boom towns thrown up in haste, abandoned just as quickly when the promise of prosperity proved false. This Hartley, he a reasonable man? The well-digger selected a tin of tobacco, though he didn't smoke. It helped to buy something when gathering information. "Reasonable enough, considering. Came out here from Indiana 3 years back, with his wife Mary and 2 little ones. Bought that section from the land office fair and square, though Magnus Thornton tried to claim prior rights." She paused, glancing toward the window as if the cattle baron might materialize from the dust. "Thornton owns the Circle T, controls most of the water rights in the valley. He's got a way of getting what he wants, eventually." The well-digger processed this information while counting out coins for his purchase. In 20 years of wandering the territories, he'd encountered the Magnus Thorntons of the world often enough.
Men who'd arrived early, claimed the best resources, and viewed newcomers as either servants or obstacles. A younger man entered the store, badge glinting despite the dim light. Deputy Marcus Webb carried himself with the uncertain authority of someone still growing into his position. 28, maybe 29, with the kind of earnest face that suggested he still believed in justice as something more than a word. "Afternoon, Mrs. Morrison." The deputy touched his hat brim, then noticed the stranger. "New in town?" "Just arrived. I dig wells." Simple truths often served better than elaborate introductions. "Wells?" The deputy's interest sharpened. "You might want to talk to Samuel Hartley."
Though, fair warning, that land of his seems to reject water like oil rejects rain. The well-digger noted how even the lawman spoke of the land as if it had intentions, preferences, grudges. This was the frontier's peculiar animism, where civilization's thin veneer couldn't quite cover the older belief that the land itself was alive, watching, judging. He thanked them both and stepped back into the dying afternoon. The dust storm was beginning to settle, revealing the valley in stages like a photographer's plate developing. To the west, he could make out the vast expanse of Thornton's ranch, cattle dotting the landscape like periods in an endless sentence. To the east, smaller homesteads carved geometric defiance into the prairie grass. The well-digger had arrived in Red Clay Valley as he'd arrived in dozens of settlements before, anonymous, necessary, temporary. Yet something about this place, perhaps the way the light caught the red earth as the dust settled, suggested this might be different. Not home. He'd given up on that concept when drought took his Missouri farm, but perhaps a place where his particular skills might matter more than usual. He found lodging at what generously called itself a hotel, but was really just a boarding house run by a German widow who communicated mainly through suspicious looks and pointed gestures. His room contained a narrow bed, a wash stand, and a window that looked out onto the main street. Spartan, but he'd slept in far worse. That evening, as he cleaned his tools and checked his equipment, the well-digger reflected on what he'd learned. A cursed farm, a powerful rancher, failing wells, and underneath it all, the eternal struggle for water in a land that hoarded it like a miser hoards gold. He'd seen this story before, in different variations, across the territories. But something about the specificity of the failures, 3 wells, all drying within a month, suggested a pattern that had nothing to do with curses and everything to do with the calculable malice of men. Tomorrow he would visit the Hartley farm, perform his ritual with the hazel rod for those who needed to believe in something beyond mere geology, and begin the real work of understanding what the land was trying to tell him. Because the land always told the truth, if you knew how to listen. It was people who lied, schemed, and corrupted the natural order of things. The moon rose over Red Clay Valley, a silver coin in the vast purchase of the night sky, and somewhere in the distance a coyote offered its opinion on the whole human enterprise. Samuel Hartley's handshake told the well-digger everything he needed to know about the man's situation, firm enough to show character, but with that slight tremor of desperation that comes from watching hopes dry up like his wells. Early July had brought no relief from the heat, and the 2 men stood in what passed for shade beside Hartley's modest farmhouse, surveying the land that had become his beautiful prison. "I appreciate you coming out," Hartley said, wiping his brow with a sleeve that had seen too many washings. Most well-diggers won't even consider the job once they hear the history. The well-diggers studied the terrain with practiced eyes. The land rolled gently toward a distant creek, Willow Creek, according to his map, with scattered cottonwoods marking the underground water's path. Good signs, typically. Yet 3 failed wells suggested something more complex than simple bad luck. "Show me the wells," he said, and Hartley led him on what had become a tour of failure. The first well stood 50 yards from the house, its wooden frame weathered but intact. The well-digger dropped a stone, counting the seconds until the hollow thunk echoed back, dry as bone. He knelt, running his fingers along the rim, noting the mineral deposits, white crystals that caught the morning light in a way that seemed almost mocking. "Dug this one myself the first year," Hartley explained, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "Hit water at 30 feet. Sweet, clear water. My wife Mary cried when she tasted it. First time she'd believed we might actually make it here." The second well, 100 yards south, told a similar story. Professional construction this time, proper stone lining, a windmill that now stood motionless as a monument to failed ambition. The well-digger examined the rope, still damp in places, suggesting recent attempts to find water that simply wasn't there. "Hired a team from Guthrie for that one," Hartley continued. "Cost me nearly everything we'd saved. Water was good for 28 days, then started tasting off. By day 35, even the horses wouldn't drink it." At the third well, newest and most elaborate, the well-digger found what he'd been looking for. He scraped at the crystalline deposits with his knife, touched the blade to his tongue, and immediately spat. Salt. Not just traces, but concentrated deposits that suggested something unnatural. "When did you dig this one?" he asked, though he kept his tone neutral, almost disinterested. "Last September. This time I brought in a diviner from Kansas City, man who swore he'd never failed to find good water." Hartley's laugh carried no humor. "Found it all right. Lasted 31 days. The well-digger stood, brushing dust from his knees, and gazed toward the northwest where Thornton's ranch sprawled across the horizon. The wind carried the distant lowing of cattle, hundreds of head that needed water, controlled by a man who controlled the valley's major water rights. "Tell me about the Cherokee warning," he said, pulling out his notebook to sketch the positions of the wells. Hartley shifted uncomfortably. "Old Joseph Two Rivers lives about 3 miles east. He found me not long after I'd bought the land. Told me this place had been poisoned by greed. Said the water would turn against anyone who tried to farm here. I figured it was just an old man's way of scaring off settlers, but now..." The well-digger had encountered such warnings before. Sometimes they were genuine cultural knowledge, sometimes strategic discouragement, and sometimes they contained coded truths that required interpretation. He made a mental note to visit Joseph Two Rivers. "Your neighbor, Thornton, he ever make an offer on your land?" "4 times, Hartley admitted. "Each time lower than the last. Says he's doing me a favor, offering anything at all for cursed ground." They were interrupted by Mary Hartley calling from the house, announcing the noon meal. She was 32, worn by worry but not broken by it, with 2 children clinging to her skirts like shadows seeking shade. The well-digger accepted the invitation, knowing that shared meals often revealed more than formal interviews. The Hartley home's interior spoke of transplanted dreams, curtains that belonged to a more gentle climate, a piano that must have cost a fortune to freight from Indiana, books wrapped in oilcloth against the dust. They ate beans and cornbread, good solid food that couldn't quite mask the underlying anxiety of dwindling resources. "My husband says you're going to find water," Mary said, not quite making it a question. The well-digger had learned to navigate such moments carefully. "I'm going to try to understand why your water keeps failing. Sometimes the solution isn't where we first look." The children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, watched him with the intense curiosity of the isolated young. The boy finally worked up courage to speak.
"Mister, are you going to use a magic stick?" "Tommy," his mother admonished, but the well-digger smiled. "Some call it that. It's hazelwood, good for finding water. Though, between you and me," he leaned in conspiratorially, "the real magic is in knowing how to read what the earth's trying to tell us." After the meal, he walked the property's perimeter, ostensibly searching for the optimal spot for a new well, but actually studying the geological patterns. The land sloped almost imperceptibly toward Willow Creek, and he noticed something interesting: a band of different colored soil, suggesting a change in the underlying rock structure. He knelt, dug a small hole with his knife, and found what he'd suspected: shale, porous and laminar, the kind that could carry water horizontally for miles. As the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, he performed the expected ritual with his divining rod, knowing that Hartley needed to see it, needed to believe that this time would be different.
The hazel branch pulled downward at several spots, as it always did when he subtly guided it. But he marked only one location, near an old cottonwood that had somehow survived where planted crops struggled. "Here," he said with the confidence that clients required, "but I'll need a few days to properly survey. Water's tricky in this formation. You have to approach it right." Hartley's relief was palpable. "Whatever you need, we're running out of options." As the well-digger prepared to leave, he noticed something that confirmed his suspicions. Along the fence line that divided Hartley's land from Thornton's vast holdings, there was a subtle depression in the earth, the kind that suggested underground water flow. But the vegetation along this depression showed signs of stress: yellowed leaves, stunted growth. Plants that should thrive near water were instead retreating from it. "Mr. Hartley," he said carefully, "when your wells failed, did the water change gradually or suddenly?" Hartley thought for a moment. Now that you mention it, it was strange. Each time the water went bad almost overnight, like someone had flipped a switch. The well-digger nodded, filing this information away. He'd seen enough to form a hypothesis, but proving it would require careful investigation. The curse on this land wasn't supernatural. It was commercial, calculated, and cruel in the particular way that greed always was when it dressed itself in the clothes of inevitability. That evening, back in his boarding house room, he studied his sketches and notes by lamplight. 3 wells, all failing after roughly 30 days. Salt deposits increasing with each iteration. The porous shale that could carry contamination from miles away. And Magnus Thornton, waiting with decreasing offers as desperation increased. The pattern was clear to someone who knew how to look. The question now was not whether sabotage was occurring, but how it was being accomplished with such precision. The well-digger had solved puzzles like this before, but rarely with such systematic malevolence. Outside, a freight wagon rumbled through town, heading toward Thornton's ranch. The well-digger watched from his window, noting how heavily loaded it was, how the drivers seemed eager to complete their delivery before full dark. Salt was heavy, he reflected.
heavy enough to require substantial freight charges, unless you were ordering it in quantities large enough to negotiate better rates. Quantities that a cattle operation might legitimately need, with plenty left over for other purposes. The performance began at sunrise, as these things should. Word had spread through Red Clay Valley that the new well digger would be working the Hartley place, and by the time the morning light painted the red earth gold, a small crowd had gathered.
The well digger understood this ritual, not the divining itself, but the community's need to witness it, to participate in hope, even when experience counseled against it. He held the hazel rod before him like a conductor preparing an orchestra, letting the observers see its simple elegance. The Y-shaped branch, cut fresh that morning from a tree near Willow Creek, still wept sap from its wounds. Deputy Webb stood among the watchers, ostensibly there to keep order, but clearly curious himself. Clara Morrison had closed her store for an hour, an almost unprecedented event that underscored the importance of water to everyone's survival. "The rod seeks its own kind," the well digger explained, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades' experience. "Water calls to the water that once ran through this living wood." He began his slow walk across Hartley's land, holding the rod loosely, letting his steps fall into the measured rhythm that audiences expected. What he was actually doing was studying the stratification of exposed rock faces, noting the angle of geological layers, observing where morning dew lingered longest. The divining rod was theater. The real work happened in the subtle reading of 1,000 small signs. Near the old cottonwood, the rod dipped sharply, or rather, he allowed it to dip, having already determined this as the optimal location. The crowd murmured appreciatively. Samuel Hartley's face showed that terrible mixture of hope and fear that the well digger had seen too often, while Mary Hartley clutched her children's hands as if the rod's movement might determine their entire future. Which, he reflected, it very well might. "The water runs deep here," he announced, kneeling to examine the soil. 40, maybe 45 feet. But there's something unusual about the rock structure. He pulled out his knife and carved a small test hole, extracting samples of earth at different depths. The shale appeared exactly as he'd expected, porous, laminar, with tiny gaps between layers that could carry water horizontally for extraordinary distances. More importantly, these gaps could carry other things. "You see this?" He held up a piece of the shale for the crowd's inspection. "This rock is like a sponge, but sideways. Water doesn't just go down through it, it travels along it, sometimes for miles." Magnus Thornton chose that moment to arrive, riding a bay stallion that probably cost more than Hartley's entire farm. 58 years old, but sitting his horse like a man half that age, Thornton commanded attention through sheer presence. His foreman, a weather-beaten man named Brooks, remained mounted beside him. "Another well, Hartley?" Thornton's voice carried false sympathy like a snake carries venom. "How many failures will it take before you accept what the Cherokee have been saying?" Before Hartley could respond, another voice cut through the morning air. "The Cherokee say many things. White men choose which ones to hear." Joseph Two Rivers had appeared with the silence that seemed to be his trademark. 71 years old, wearing a mixture of traditional and modern clothing that somehow looked entirely natural, he walked with a slight limp from some old injury, but moved with surprising grace. His eyes, dark and knowing, fixed on Thornton with an expression the well digger couldn't quite read. "Joseph,"
Thornton acknowledged with minimal courtesy. "Come to spread more of your curses?" "I don't curse land," the old man replied. "Men do that themselves, with their greed and blindness." The well-digger watched this exchange with interest. There was history here, layers of it, like the geological strata he'd been studying. He made a decision that surprised himself. "Mr. Two Rivers," he called out, "I'd value your knowledge of this land's water. Would you walk with me?" The crowd stirred uneasily. It was one thing for a white well-digger to use divining rods. That was accepted, even expected. It was another to publicly seek indigenous knowledge. But Joseph approached with dignity, and together they walked the marked spot. "You know something?" Joseph said quietly, pitched for the well-digger's ears alone. "You see what others miss." "I see patterns," the well-digger replied equally quietly. "But patterns need context. How long has this poisoning been happening?" Joseph's weathered face showed surprise, then something like approval. "My people knew this valley for generations. The water was always good, until the great herds came. Then certain springs began to fail, always near where powerful men wanted land." They were interrupted by Deputy Webb, who had been pulled aside by an agitated homesteader. "My cattle," the man was saying, "3 head, gone. Branded stock, taken right from my south pasture." The deputy looked harassed, torn between duties. The well-digger noticed how Thornton's foreman Brooks smiled slightly, as if rustling were an expected cost of doing business on the frontier. Or perhaps, the well-digger thought, a useful tool for keeping smaller ranchers distracted and afraid. "When did you notice the missing?" Webb asked, pulling out his notebook. "This morning, but there's tracks, deputy, clear as day, heading toward the Henderson place." The well-digger knew the Hendersons by reputation, a family of freed slaves trying to establish themselves, vulnerable and isolated, convenient scapegoats for whoever actually took the cattle. "I'll investigate immediately," Webb promised, and the well-digger saw the young lawman's genuine desire to do right, warring with the complexities of frontier justice. As the crowd began to disperse, the well-digger made his real discoveries. Walking with Joseph, he learned that the failures followed a pattern tied to the lunar month. "Always at the new moon," the old man said. "When the night is darkest." Later, examining the old wells with his testing kit and collection of bottles and chemicals that most observers assumed were for divining, but actually tested for mineral content, he found traces of sodium chloride in concentrations that nature alone couldn't explain. The salt had been introduced to the water table upstream, carried through the porous shale to contaminate wells in a targeted area. That afternoon, he set up his surveying equipment, using the pretense of determining the exact drilling angle to conduct a broader investigation. Through his transit telescope, ostensibly checking elevations, he observed Thornton's ranch operations. The cattle operation was massive, but not massive enough to explain the monthly freight wagons of supplies. Clara Morrison proved informative when he stopped for supplies. "My late husband, God rest him, he knew about water," she said, measuring out rope for the well project. "Told me once that Thornton had tried to buy our water rights years ago. When we refused, our well went bad within a month. We never could prove anything." "What happened to your husband?" the well-digger asked carefully. "Took sick after drinking bad water. Doctor said it was natural causes, but a man doesn't go from healthy to dead in 3 days from natural causes." Her hands tightened on the counter.
That was 8 years ago. I've hauled water from the town well ever since." The well digger purchased more supplies than he needed, a small gesture of solidarity. As he prepared to leave, she added, "Be careful. Thornton's patient as a spider. He'll wait until you're committed. Then things will start happening." That evening, he met secretly with Hartley to discuss the well placement. "We'll go deep," he explained, sketching diagrams by lamplight. "Deeper than usual. And we'll line it differently. Use a double wall with gravel between. It'll cost more, but it might filter out impurities." "You think the curse is real?" Hartley asked, desperate for any explanation that wasn't random cruelty. The well digger chose his words carefully. "I think someone's helping the curse along. The question is how to prove it and how to prevent it." Through the window, they could see lights from Thornton's ranch spread across the darkness like a constellation of wealth and power. Somewhere between here and there, the well digger suspected, was the mechanism of sabotage, precise, repeatable, and hidden by the vastness of the territory and the weakness of law. The full moon illuminated Willow Creek like a silver ribbon threading through the valley, perfect conditions for what the well digger had planned. He'd told no one about his midnight investigation, trusting only in his own ability to move quietly through terrain he'd been studying for weeks. Late July had brought no rain, and the creek ran lower than usual, exposing banks that normally remained hidden. He followed the water upstream, away from Hartley's property, toward where it wound through Thornton's vast holdings. Every few hundred yards, he stopped to test the water with his kit, litmus papers, silver nitrate solution, and other chemicals that revealed water's hidden character. The results confirmed what he'd suspected. Salinity increased dramatically above a certain point, then decreased again as he moved further upstream. The contamination zone was specific, deliberate, localized. Near a bend where cottonwoods clustered thick, he found what he'd been looking for: wagon tracks, deep and regular, leading to the creek's edge. The ground here had been worn smooth by repeated use, and white crystalline residue clung to the grass like an accusation. He knelt, touched finger to residue, tasted carefully. Salt. But not just any salt. This had the bitter afternote of industrial-grade sodium chloride, the kind used in massive quantities for preserving meat, treating hides, and a dozen other ranch operations. A sound made him freeze. Horses approaching, moving without urgency, but with purpose. He melted into the cottonwood shadows, watching as 3 riders appeared, their faces hidden by hat brims and darkness. They led a 4th horse pulling a sledge loaded with heavy sacks. "Same spot as always," one rider said, voice carrying in the still night. "Don't know why Mr. Thornton insists on the new moon," another replied. "Not like anyone's watching." The well digger smiled grimly at the irony. Someone was watching, though he kept himself still as the dead while the men unloaded sack after sack, slitting them open and pouring the contents into the creek. The white crystals disappeared into the dark water like secrets dissolved into lies. The entire operation took less than 20 minutes, practiced, efficient, routine. After they left, he collected samples of the water, the residue, and even some of the burlap sacking they'd carelessly left behind. The sacks bore a stamp: Chicago Packing Company, industrial grade. Not the kind of thing a legitimate cattle operation would order in such quantities. The next morning, he visited Clara Morrison's store under the pretense of buying more supplies. She greeted him with her usual sharp assessment, but something in his expression made her lean forward. "You found something," she said. It wasn't a question. "I need to know about your husband's discovery," he said quietly. "The exact timing of when your well went bad." She glanced around the empty store, then pulled out a ledger from beneath the counter. But this wasn't a business ledger. It was a diary, kept in a man's careful hand. "Robert documented everything," she said, opening to marked pages. "Here, July 1886, our well tested clean. July 19th, new moon. August 20th, the water turned brackish. We hauled water for a week, hoping it would clear. August 28th, Robert took sick. The well digger studied the entries, noting the meticulous documentation of temperatures, rainfall, and water quality. Robert Morrison had been conducting his own investigation, cut short by what the doctor called natural causes. "Your husband was getting close to the truth," he said softly. "Too close." Her voice carried 8 years of suppressed anger. "Thornton came to the funeral, offered to buy the store, said I couldn't manage alone. I told him I'd burn it down first." Their conversation was interrupted by Deputy Webb entering with a troubled expression. The rustling investigation had taken an ugly turn. The Henderson family, the freed slaves the well digger had heard about, were being accused despite questionable evidence. "The tracks are clear," Webb said, though doubt colored his voice. "But something doesn't sit right. The Hendersons barely have enough to eat, let alone capacity to hide stolen cattle." "Maybe someone wanted those tracks to be clear," the well digger suggested carefully. Webb looked at him sharply. "That's a dangerous thing to suggest without proof." "Seems like a lot of things happen in this valley without proof," Clara interjected. "Wells going bad, homesteaders getting blamed for rustling, good men taking sick from bad water." The deputy shifted uncomfortably. At 28, he was caught between his ideals and the practical realities of keeping peace in a territory where might often made right. The well digger recognized the struggle. He'd seen it in dozens of young lawmen across the frontier. That afternoon, the well digger returned to the Hartley farm to begin preparations for digging. He'd identified the spot, deeper than the water table that fed the contaminated zone. It would mean more work, more expense, but it might tap into an older, deeper aquifer protected by layers of impermeable rock. Samuel Hartley watched anxiously as the well digger marked the drilling site. "You seem troubled," Hartley observed. "Is there something wrong with the location?" "The location is fine," the well digger replied, choosing his words carefully. "But I need you to understand something. Even if we find good water, keeping it good might require vigilance." Mary Hartley had joined them, her 2 children playing nearby with cornhusk dolls. "You mean the curse," she said flatly. "I mean that sometimes what people call curses are just men acting in darkness." He looked toward Thornton's ranch. "Tell me, when Thornton makes his offers to buy your land, what does he say?" "That we're fools to fight the inevitable," Samuel replied. "That the land itself rejects us. And yet his cattle thrive on the same land just across your fence line," the well digger pointed out. "Curious how selective this curse is." That evening, he made another discovery. While examining maps at the land office, he found that Thornton had been systematically acquiring properties along Willow Creek for the past decade. Each acquisition followed a pattern: water problems, desperate sellers, below market prices.
The creek essentially gave Thornton a delivery system for contamination that could target specific properties based on the underground water flow. The clerk, a nervous man named Patterson, volunteered information when pressed. "Mr. Thornton's lawyer was here last week, checking on the Hartley deed, making sure everything would be proper when the time came to transfer ownership." "He seemed that certain Hartley would sell?" Patterson adjusted his spectacles nervously. "Mr. Thornton usually gets what he wants. It's healthier that way." Walking back through town as darkness fell, the well-digger noticed a pattern he'd missed before.
The businesses that thrived were those that had accommodated Thornton's interests. Those that had resisted showed signs of struggle: empty storefronts, foreclosure notices, families loading wagons to leave. He stopped at Joseph Two Rivers' dwelling, a modest structure that blended Cherokee tradition with frontier practicality. The old man was working clay, his hands shaping pottery with practiced ease despite his 71 years. "You know the truth about the water," Joseph said without preamble. "The question is what you'll do with that knowledge." "The truth needs proof that will stand up to law," the well-digger replied. Joseph's weathered face creased in what might have been amusement. "Law, yes, the white man's law, which bends like river reeds before the wind of money and power." He set aside his pottery. "But there are older laws. The land remembers everything, every poison poured into it, every lie told about it." "Help me remember then," the well-digger said. When did this pattern begin? Joseph was quiet for a long moment, then began to speak of things he'd witnessed. The systematic poisoning of water sources that had driven his people from traditional camps. The accumulation of land by those who understood that controlling water meant controlling everything in this dry territory. "Thornton learned from those who came before," Joseph concluded. "But he perfected the method. Salt leaves no trace that law recognizes, takes no life quickly enough to prove murder, only makes the land unusable for any but those who know which water is safe." The well-digger left with much to consider. Evidence was mounting, but frontier justice required either overwhelming proof or popular support. Thornton had the money to avoid the first and the power to suppress the second. Unless he could find a way to make the contamination fail, to protect the Hartley well permanently, the pattern would continue. Tomorrow he would begin digging, but tonight he studied his samples and charts, searching for the solution that would break the cycle. The rhythm of digging had its own meditation, each strike of the pickaxe a conversation with the earth. Early August brought the kind of heat that made the air shimmer like water, and the well-digger had been at work since dawn, helped by Samuel Hartley and 2 hired hands from town. They'd already gone down 15 feet, the walls of the shaft revealing the geological story of the valley. Topsoil giving way to clay, clay to sandstone, sandstone to that treacherous layer of porous shale. "Take a break," the well-digger called up from the depths. The men above lowered the bucket, and he climbed the rope ladder with practiced ease, emerging into sunlight that temporarily blinded him. Mary Hartley stood ready with water and towels, her children beside her. The family had developed a routine around the digging. Meals served precisely at noon, fresh water every 2 hours, the children collecting the excavated stones for their mother's planned garden wall. It was the kind of domestic rhythm that transformed work into ritual, hope into daily practice. "How deep will you go?" young Tommy asked, peering into the shaft with 8-year-old fascination. "Deep as it takes," the well-digger replied, accepting a ladle of water gratefully. "But I'm looking for something specific. A layer of blue clay that should sit below the shale."
Water there comes from rain that fell when your grandfather was young, filtered through rock for decades. Clean water, protected water. What he didn't say was that this deeper drilling was also strategic. The contaminated water from Willow Creek traveled through the upper aquifer. By penetrating to a lower level, sealed off by impermeable clay, he hoped to access water that Thornton's salt couldn't reach.
As they ate their noon meal in the shade of the house, a buggy approached. Thornton himself, dressed for business despite the heat, accompanied by his foreman, Brooks, and another man the well-digger didn't recognize. "Gentlemen," Thornton said, not bothering to dismount, "I thought I'd see how the latest attempt was progressing." "Well enough," Hartley replied, tension visible in his shoulders. Thornton's companion, a thin man with calculating eyes, spoke up. "Mr. Thornton's offer still stands, Hartley. $300 for the whole parcel. That's generous for land that won't hold water." "The land holds water fine," the well-digger interjected, standing slowly. "It's what's being done to that water that's the problem." The atmosphere changed, became charged like the air before a thunderstorm. Thornton's eyes, cold as Winter Creek water, fixed on the well-digger. "That's a serious accusation to make without proof," Thornton said softly. "A man could find himself in trouble making such claims." "A man finds trouble lots of ways in this valley," the well-digger replied evenly. "Some by speaking truth, others by poisoning their neighbors' wells." Brooks's hand moved toward his sidearm, but Thornton raised a finger, stopping him. "You're a stranger here, well-digger. Perhaps you don't understand how things work." "I understand how water works, how salt dissolves and travels through porous rock, how industrial-grade sodium chloride from the Chicago Packing Company has uses beyond preserving beef." The silence stretched taut as fence wire. Thornton's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, the predator recognizing another predator. "Be careful your well doesn't suffer an accident," Thornton said finally. "These frontier constructions can be dangerous. Cave-ins, bad air, all manner of misfortunes." After they left, Hartley was pale beneath his sun-weathered skin. "You shouldn't have challenged him directly. Sometimes a man needs to know he's being watched," the well-digger replied. But privately, he knew he'd taken a risk. Men like Thornton didn't appreciate exposure, even threatened exposure. That afternoon, as they continued digging, Deputy Webb arrived with unexpected news. The Henderson family had been cleared of rustling charges. The stolen cattle had been found in a box canyon on Thornton's own land, apparently wandered there, according to Brooks. "Convenient," the well-digger commented, pausing in his work. Webb's expression showed he shared the skepticism. "Too convenient, but without proof of intentional false accusation. You're doing your best with what you have," the well-digger said, recognizing the young man's frustration. "That counts for something." They reached 25 feet by evening, and the well-digger noted with satisfaction the appearance of the blue clay layer he'd been seeking. Tomorrow, they'd penetrate through to what he hoped would be protected water. That night, he kept watch from a concealed position near the well site. His caution proved justified. Near midnight, 3 riders approached silently. Not Thornton's usual men, but rougher types, the kind that drifted through territories taking whatever work paid best. They dismounted near the well, and one produced what looked like a stick of dynamite. The well-digger had seen enough. He fired his rifle into the air, the sharp crack splitting the night. The riders scrambled for their horses as lights appeared in the Hartley house. By the time Samuel emerged with his own rifle, the intruders were disappearing into darkness. Hartley began. "Men who wanted your well to have an accident," the well digger replied grimly. "We'll need to post guards from now on." The next morning brought an unexpected ally. Clara Morrison arrived with a wagon loaded with supplies and something more valuable: documentation. "Robert wasn't the only one keeping records," she said, producing a box of papers. "These are receipts, shipping manifests, dated observations from a dozen farmers whose wells failed over the years." The well digger examined the documents with growing excitement. Here was pattern made visible. Dates correlating with new moons, shipping records showing massive salt purchases, a careful chronicle of Thornton's expanding empire built on poisoned water. "This is evidence," he said. "Evidence needs someone willing to act on it," Clara replied pragmatically. "But maybe it's a start." They were interrupted by Joseph Two Rivers, who rarely came to town but had made an exception. "The water you seek is there," he told the well digger, gesturing toward the well. "My grandfather knew this land before the boundaries, before the claims. That deep water runs from the sacred hills, too far and too deep for any man's poison to reach." "You knew this all along?" Joseph's weathered face crinkled. "Knowledge given too freely is rarely valued. You had to discover the truth yourself, just as young Deputy Webb must discover what kind of lawman he'll be, just as the Hartleys must discover whether they have the strength to stay." The digging continued through the afternoon heat. At 35 feet, the drill bit broke through into a cavity, and the sound of water, clear and urgent, rose from below. The well digger dropped a weighted line, felt it sink into substantial depth. When he hauled up a sample, the water was cold, clear, with the mineral taste of deep aquifers. "Test it," Hartley said anxiously. The well digger applied his full battery of tests. No salt, no contamination, just pure water that had been filtering through rock since before the Civil War. He looked up at the circle of anxious faces, the Hartleys, Clara, Joseph, even Deputy Webb, who'd arrived to check on the disturbance from the night before. "It's good," he said simply. "And it'll stay good." Mary Hartley began to cry, her children hugging her skirts. Samuel's shoulders sagged with relief. But the well digger knew this was only part of the solution. They had good water, but Thornton still had power, still had his system of intimidation and control. "Now what?" Webb asked. And the well digger heard in that question not just curiosity, but a request for guidance. "Now we make sure others can do the same," he replied. "One well doesn't break a monopoly, but knowledge of how to dig past the poison, that might." The sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of gold and red, and somewhere a meadowlark offered its liquid song to the approaching night. The well digger allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He'd found water, yes, but more than that. He'd begun something that might outlast any single well. The August heat had baked the earth to the consistency of fired brick, making the well digger's surveillance all the more challenging. He'd been tracking Thornton's supply wagons for 3 days now, following at a distance that wouldn't arouse suspicion, mapping their routes and timing their deliveries. The pattern was becoming clear. Every 2 weeks, a special shipment arrived from the railroad depot at Guthrie, always at night, always taking a circuitous route to Thornton's ranch. Tonight would be different. Tonight, he would follow them all the way. He'd told Hartley he was traveling to the county seat to file paperwork for the well certification, a reasonable excuse that wouldn't raise questions. In truth, he'd positioned himself near the depot, watching from the shadow of a grain elevator as the evening freight train disgorged its cargo. There, 4 wagons, heavy laden, their wheels cutting deep grooves in the dust. The drivers wore no insignia, but he recognized one from that night at Willow Creek. They headed north, away from the direct route to Thornton's ranch, and the well digger followed on horseback, maintaining a careful distance under the waning moon's pale light. The wagons stopped at a nondescript barn 5 miles from the Circle T's main compound. Here, the well digger witnessed an operation of impressive efficiency. The crews unloaded 100-pound sacks with practiced ease, stacking them in the barn with military precision. But more interesting was what happened next. They reloaded half the wagons with different sacks, ones bearing the legitimate marking of cattle feed supplement. Smart, he murmured to himself. Hiding industrial salt shipments within regular ranch supplies, maintaining plausible deniability should anyone investigate. A cattle operation Thornton's size would naturally need salt for the animals, just not in these quantities. He waited until the wagons departed, then approached the barn carefully. The lock was substantial but not complicated. His years of working with tools had given him certain skills beyond well digging. Inside, the scale of the operation became apparent. Hundreds of sacks, tons of salt, enough to contaminate every well in the valley for years. But more damning was the ledger he found in a desk drawer. Dates, amounts, and most importantly, target properties marked on a hand-drawn map. The Hartley farm was there, marked with a red X and the notation, July application complete. So were a dozen other properties, some marked acquired, others marked pending. He copied the crucial pages in his notebook by lamplight, then carefully returned everything to its place. Evidence, finally, though he knew the challenge would be finding someone with both the authority and courage to act on it. The next morning, he met Deputy Webb at Clara Morrison's store, choosing the location carefully. Clara's presence would add weight to what he had to share, and her store provided neutral ground. "What you're showing me," Webb said after examining the copied ledger pages, "this suggests a conspiracy going back years." 8 years at least, Clara added pointedly. "Back to when my Robert died." Webb, despite his youth, wasn't naive about frontier justice. Even with this, Thornton has lawyers, influence. The territorial judge is his cousin by marriage. "Then we don't go through the territorial system," the well digger suggested. "Federal marshals have jurisdiction over interstate commerce fraud. Shipping industrial chemicals across state lines for purposes of property fraud, that's federal." The deputy's eyes sharpened with interest. This was a path he hadn't considered. "I'd need more proof, documentation of the shipments, witness testimony." "The shipping manifests will be at the depot," Clara offered. "Patterson at the land office might have records of the property transfers." They were interrupted by commotion outside, riders approaching fast. Through the window they saw Brooks and several of Thornton's men, their faces grim with purpose. But they passed the store heading toward the Hartley farm. "Something's wrong," the well digger said, already moving for the door. They arrived at the farm to find a standoff. Thornton himself sat his horse before the house, while Samuel Hartley stood on his porch with his rifle. Mary had the children inside, but the well digger could see her watching through the window. "Your well's an illegal construction," Thornton was saying, waving an official-looking document, "drilled without proper permits from the Territorial Water Authority." "Since when do we need permits to dig wells on our own land?" Hartley demanded. "Since the new regulations passed last month." "Retroactive to all wells drilled this year." Thornton's smile was cold as winter frost. "You'll need to cease use immediately and pay a substantial fine." Webb stepped forward, his badge catching the sun. "Let me see that document." Thornton's man, Brooks, bristled, but Thornton handed it over with exaggerated courtesy. "You'll find it's all legal, Deputy. Signed by Judge Morrison. No relation to our shopkeeper, of course." The well-digger watched Webb read the document, saw the young man's jaw tighten. It might be legal, but it was clearly targeted, designed specifically to impact the Hartley well while exempting established wells on larger ranches. "This regulation seems awfully specific," Webb observed carefully. "The law is often specific," Thornton replied. "Mr. Hartley has 3 days to comply, or I'll be forced to seek enforcement through the courts." After Thornton's party left, the group gathered in the Hartley kitchen. The mood was grim, but the well-digger noticed something had shifted in Deputy Webb's demeanor, a hardening of resolve. "He's overplaying his hand," Webb said. "This regulation, it's too obvious, too targeted. If we can combine this with the evidence of the salt contamination, we need those shipping records," the well-digger said, "and we need them before Thornton realizes we're investigating." Joseph Two Rivers, who had arrived during the confrontation, spoke from his corner seat. "The moon is right tonight, dark enough for necessary work." That night, a curious alliance formed. The well-digger and Webb approached the depot, while Clara created a distraction at the other end of town, claiming her store had been robbed. Patterson from the land office, nervous but determined after Webb promised protection, provided them access to the shipping office. The records were there. Years of shipments, far exceeding any legitimate agricultural need. More importantly, they found correspondence between Thornton and the Chicago supplier discussing special application requirements and territorial expansion opportunities. "This is it," Webb breathed, gathering the documents. "This is conspiracy, fraud, maybe even racketeering." But as they prepared to leave, lamplight flooded the office. Brooks stood in the doorway, pistol drawn. "Mr. Thornton figured you might try something stupid." The moment stretched taut, 3 men calculating odds and consequences. Then, from behind Brooks, Joseph Two Rivers' voice emerged from darkness. "The gun is a young man's solution to old problems." Brooks spun, but Joseph's walking stick caught him across the wrist, sending the pistol spinning. Webb moved quickly, securing the weapon and the man in one professional motion. "You're under arrest for interfering with a federal investigation," Webb said, and the well-digger heard in his voice the lawman he was becoming. Brooks laughed harshly. "Federal?" "You're a territorial deputy." Webb pulled out a second badge, one the well-digger hadn't seen before. "Also a commissioned federal deputy as of last week. I've been investigating interstate fraud in the territory for 2 months. Your employer just made my case." The well-digger looked at Webb with new respect. The young man had been playing a longer game than anyone realized. "You knew?" he asked. "I suspected. But I needed proof, and I needed someone with the expertise to understand the mechanism." Webb gathered the documents carefully. "Your investigation of the wells provided that." As they secured Brooks and the evidence, the well-digger reflected on how assumptions could blind a man. He'd seen Webb as an overwhelmed local lawman, just as Thornton had seen him as merely a traveling well-digger. Both had been wrong, and in that mutual underestimation lay the seed of Thornton's downfall.
Dawn was breaking as they returned to town, painting the valley in shades of rose and gold.
The well-digger knew the fight wasn't over. Thornton had resources, lawyers, connections. But the evidence was solid now. Federal authority was engaged, and most importantly, the community had begun to understand that the curse on their land wasn't supernatural, but criminal. The Methodist Church at the edge of Red Clay Valley had never hosted such a gathering. Late August brought thunderheads that promised rain, but delivered only wind. And inside the modest wooden structure, farmers and small ranchers filled every pew and lined the walls. The well-digger stood near the back, observing as Samuel Hartley addressed the assembly with newfound confidence. "We've all suffered the same losses," Hartley was saying. "Wells failing, land becoming worthless, forced to sell or abandon homesteads we've worked years to build." The crowd murmured agreement. The well-digger recognized faces from his travels through the valley. The Schultz family who'd lost 3 wells in 18 months. The Perkins brothers who'd been forced to sell their northern section at 1/10 of its value. Old Abraham Foster, whose wife had died from what the doctor called bad water sickness. Deputy Webb stood by the door, his federal badge now openly displayed. Brooks's arrest had sent ripples through the valley, and Thornton had retreated to his ranch, lawyers circling like buzzards. But the legal process would be slow, and meanwhile, these people needed practical solutions. "The well-digger here has shown us something important," Hartley continued, gesturing toward him. "The poison in our water isn't random or supernatural. It's deliberate, and it can be defeated." Joseph Two Rivers rose from his seat, his 71 years giving him natural authority. "My people knew this valley when the buffalo still ran thick. The deep water, the old water, it runs in channels the surface poison cannot reach. But you must dig past fear, past the easy water, to find it." The well-digger stepped forward, unrolling a geological map he'd been preparing. "The contamination travels through this upper shale layer," he explained, tracing the formations with his finger. "But beneath it, separated by blue clay that water can't penetrate, lies an older aquifer. It means drilling deeper, 40 feet instead of 20. More expense, more time, but clean water that can't be poisoned from above." "We can't afford deeper wells," someone called out. "Thornton's made sure of that." This was the moment the well-digger had been preparing for. What if you didn't each need a separate well? What if neighbors shared wells, shared the cost and the water? The suggestion ran counter to the frontier ethic of self-reliance, and he could see resistance in some faces. But Clara Morrison stood up, her voice cutting through the murmur of doubt. "My Robert would have supported this," she said firmly. "He always said the frontier's greatest lie was that we succeed alone. We survive together, or we fail separately." An unexpected voice added support. Patterson from the land office, who'd slipped in late. "I can help with the legal framework," he offered nervously. "Water cooperatives are recognized in territorial law. If properly registered, they'd have standing that individual wells might not." The discussion continued for hours, sometimes heated, always passionate. The well-digger shared his technical knowledge freely,
how to identify the blue clay layer, how to construct filtration systems using gravel and sand, how to test water for contamination using simple chemicals available from any pharmacy. By evening, they'd formed the Valley Water Cooperative with 5 shared wells planned at strategic locations.
Each well would serve 3 to 4 families, with costs and maintenance shared equally. More importantly, Webb would document everything, creating a federal record that would be harder for Thornton to challenge. Over the following days, the well diggers supervised the beginning of the first cooperative well, located on the boundary between 3 properties. The work went quickly, with many hands participating. Women brought food, children carried water, and even Joseph Two Rivers contributed, performing a blessing ceremony that, while perhaps not necessary for the water, was vital for community morale. On the 3rd day of digging, Thornton appeared. He came alone this time, which the well digger found more ominous than if he'd brought his usual contingent. The cattle baron sat his horse, watching the work with an unreadable expression. "You've caused me considerable inconvenience," he said finally, addressing the well digger directly. "I've dug wells."
That's what I do.
"You've done considerably more than that." Thornton's voice carried no threat, just cold assessment. "My lawyers tell me the federal investigation will likely fail. Insufficient evidence, jurisdictional questions, the usual legal barriers. Maybe, but the people know the truth now." Thornton's smile was thin as paper. Truth, a luxury the desperate can rarely afford. He turned his attention to the gathering of workers. "I'll make a final offer. Any family that wants to sell, I'll pay fair market value as assessed before the water troubles began. Cash money, enough to start fresh somewhere else." It was a clever move, appearing reasonable while trying to break the coalition. The well digger watched faces, saw temptation in some, determination in others. Abraham Foster spoke up, his voice cracked but firm. "My wife is buried on my land. I'll not sell her resting place to the man who poisoned her." Others nodded, the moment crystallizing into collective resolve.
Thornton observed this without apparent emotion, then wheeled his horse around. "You've made your choice. Remember that when the next challenge comes." That evening, the well digger met privately with Webb and Clara to discuss strategy. They knew Thornton wouldn't simply accept defeat. "He'll try something else," Webb predicted. "Legal challenges, intimidation, maybe even violence." "Then we document everything," Clara said. "Every threat, every suspicious incident. Build a case so solid even his cousin Judge can't ignore it." The well digger had been thinking along different lines. What if we made his scheme worthless? Not just by drilling deeper wells, but by making the land itself less attractive to him. He explained his idea, a conservation trust, legally binding the cooperative lands together with restrictions on how they could be sold or developed. Even if Thornton acquired some parcels, he couldn't assemble the vast ranch he envisioned. "That's actually brilliant," Webb admitted. "It uses the law as a shield rather than a sword." As they planned late into the night, the well digger found himself unexpectedly invested in this community's future. He'd spent years drifting, solving problems and moving on. But here was something different. Not just finding water, but helping people find their own power. The first cooperative well struck water at 42 feet, just as predicted. The celebration was modest but genuine, people tasting the clean, cold water with something approaching reverence.
The well digger performed his tests publicly, showing the complete absence of salt or contamination. "How long will it stay clean?" Mary Hartley asked. "As long as that blue clay layer holds," he replied, "which should be longer than any of us will need it." Young Tommy Hartley tugged at his sleeve. "Mister, will you teach me to find water?" The well digger looked down at the boy's eager face and felt something shift inside him.
It's not magic, you know. It's reading the land, understanding how water moves, knowing what signs to look for.
"I know," Tommy said solemnly. "That's why I want to learn." As darkness settled over the valley, the well digger stood apart from the celebration, contemplating what he'd set in motion. The cooperative was more than a practical solution. It was a fundamental challenge to the power structure that had allowed Thornton to thrive. By joining together, these supposedly powerless people had found a strength that individual resistance could never achieve. Joseph Two Rivers appeared beside him, moving with his characteristic silence. "You've given them more than water," the old man observed. "They gave it to themselves. I just showed them where to dig," Joseph smiled.
Sometimes that's all a teacher can do, show where to dig and trust others to do the work. The next morning brought news that Thornton had withdrawn his legal challenge to the Hartley well, apparently on advice from his lawyers who feared it might strengthen the federal case. It was a small victory, but victory nonetheless. September arrived with the promise of change written in the cooling evening air, and the well digger prepared for what he knew would be the crucial test. The new moon was 3 days away, the time when Thornton's men had always performed their contamination. But this time, he wouldn't be alone in watching. The cooperative's second well was nearly complete, and the well digger had installed something special, a monitoring system of his own design. Glass bottles, suspended at different depths, connected by copper tubing to a sampling station hidden beneath an innocent-looking tool shed. Every 6 hours, someone could draw samples from various levels without anyone observing being the wiser. "It's ingenious," Webb admitted, examining the mechanism. "But will it hold up as evidence?" "Combined with witness testimony and the samples themselves, it should," the well digger replied. "But we need to catch them in the act." They'd assembled a watch team. Himself, Webb, 2 of the Perkins brothers, and surprisingly Patterson from the land office, who'd found unexpected courage in collective action. Each night, they positioned themselves at key points along Willow Creek, waiting. The first night passed without incident. The second brought only the usual evening sounds: coyotes, nightbirds, the rustle of small creatures in the brush. But on the third night, under the dark of the new moon, their patience was rewarded. The well digger was stationed upstream, near the spot he'd previously observed. Just past midnight, he heard horses approaching. 4 riders moving with practiced stealth. Through his field glasses, borrowed from Webb, he could make out the sledge they pulled, loaded with familiar sacks. He gave the prearranged signal, 2 short flashes from a covered lantern. Within minutes, the others converged on his position, maintaining careful silence. Webb had insisted on proper procedure. They needed to witness the actual contamination, not just the preparation. The men at the creek worked with efficiency born of repetition. They slit the sacks, poured the contents into the water, even used long poles to stir and ensure complete dissolution. The well digger found himself oddly impressed by their thoroughness. This was sabotage, elevated to industrial precision. "Now," Webb whispered, and they moved in coordination. "Federal agents, nobody move!" Webb's voice cracked like a whip across the water. The contamination crew froze. caught literally with the evidence dissolving around their boots. One made a break for his horse, but ran directly into one of the Perkins brothers, who'd played football at an eastern college before coming west. The tackle was swift and decisive. "Evening, gentlemen," Webb said conversationally, his pistol steady. "You're under arrest for violation of federal water safety laws, interstate commerce fraud, and criminal conspiracy." One of the men, the well digger, recognized him as Thornton's foreman Brooks's cousin, spat into the creek. "You got nothing. We're just disposing of old cattle salt. At midnight? In a creek that feeds downstream wells?" Webb smiled. "And I suppose the documentation in my office showing you've done this monthly for 3 years is also about cattle salt." The man's face paled in the lantern light. They hadn't known about the documented pattern, the careful compilation of dates and damages that Clara and the well digger had assembled. As they secured the prisoners and evidence, the well digger collected water samples from multiple points, upstream at the contamination site and downstream. The amount of salt these men had introduced would create a plume of contamination that would reach the valley's wells within days, exactly as planned. Except this time, the cooperative wells would be monitoring, documenting, proving the mechanism of the sabotage. The next morning brought drama of a different sort. Thornton arrived in town with 3 lawyers and a territorial judge, not his cousin, but another man known for his flexibility regarding the law. They marched into the makeshift federal office Webb had established, demanding the release of the arrested men. The well digger watched from across the street, standing with Clara and several cooperative members. The confrontation lasted an hour, voices occasionally rising loud enough to be heard through the windows. Finally, Webb emerged, his face grim but determined. "The judge ordered their release on bail," he announced to the gathered crowd. "But the federal case proceeds, and now we have direct evidence." Thornton emerged behind his lawyers, his composure intact, but something different in his bearing, the first hint of uncertainty the well digger had seen. Their eyes met across the street, and in that moment, the well digger understood that Thornton knew his scheme was finished, at least in its current form. That afternoon, the well digger performed public tests on the water samples using the cooperative's new community center, a repurposed barn, as a makeshift laboratory. He showed the progression of contamination, the chemical reactions that revealed salt concentration, the correlation with previous well failures. "This is what's been happening to our water," he explained to the gathered families. "Not a curse, not bad luck, but deliberate poisoning for profit." Mary Hartley asked the crucial question, "Can we protect ourselves permanently?" "The deep wells help," the well digger replied, "but the real protection is knowledge and vigilance. Test your water regularly. Document any changes. Work together." Over the following days, something remarkable happened. Families who'd been preparing to abandon their claims decided to stay. The Schultz family, who'd already loaded their wagon, unpacked and asked to join the cooperative. Even some of Thornton's own ranch hands, disgusted by the revelation of the poisoning scheme, quietly offered information about other contamination sites. The well digger found himself busier than ever, not just supervising well construction, but teaching others his methods. Young Tommy Hartley proved an eager student, absorbing the lessons about geology and water flow with surprising sophistication for an 8-year-old. "You could stay," Samuel Hartley said one evening, as they worked on installing a windmill for the newest cooperative well. "The valley needs someone with your knowledge." The well digger considered this, looking out over the land that had become familiar over these weeks. "My work here is almost done. Others can maintain what we've started." "It's more than the wells," Hartley pressed. "It's what you've taught us about standing together, about understanding the land instead of fighting it." That night the well-digger walked to Joseph Two Rivers' dwelling, seeking the old man's counsel. They sat outside, watching the stars emerge in the clear prairie sky. "You're thinking of leaving," Joseph said. It wasn't a question. "It's what I do. Solve the problem, move on. And if the problem isn't solved, but transformed, if what's needed isn't leaving, but witnessing what grows from what you've planted." Before the well-digger could respond, they heard horses approaching fast. Deputy Webb arrived, dust-covered and urgent. "Thornton's made a new move," he announced. "He's filed claim on all water rights in the valley based on prior use. Says his ranch's needs supersede newer claims. He's got a federal judge in Kansas City who might support it." The well-digger felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the recognition that the fight was far from over. Thornton was adapting, finding new legal strategies to achieve what poisoning had failed to accomplish. "Then we need to establish our own prior use claims," he said, mind already working through possibilities. "Joseph, your people's use of this valley's water predates any ranch. Would you testify to that?" The old Cherokee smiled slowly. "I've been waiting 71 years for someone to ask that question properly." As they planned their response late into the night, the well-digger realized that perhaps his work here wasn't finished. The wells were just the beginning. The real task was ensuring this community could protect itself against whatever schemes men like Thornton might devise. The courtroom in Guthrie was packed beyond capacity, September heat making the air thick as syrup despite the opened windows. The well-digger sat in the witness chair, his weathered hands folded calmly, as Thornton's lawyer paced before him like a well-fed predator. "You claim to be an expert on water, yet you have no formal education, no certification from any recognized institution," the lawyer stated, managing to make competence sound like accusation. "I have 20 years of finding water where others said there was none," the well-digger replied evenly. "The earth doesn't require certificates to reveal its secrets, just patience and observation." The federal judge, brought in from Kansas City as Thornton had promised, appeared less sympathetic than hoped, but more impartial than feared. He was taking notes, actually listening, which was more than many frontier judges managed. Joseph Two Rivers had testified earlier that morning, producing an unexpected document, a treaty from 1842 that specifically mentioned Cherokee water rights in the valley. Patterson, nervous but thorough, had found the corresponding federal acknowledgement in territorial records. The legal foundation for prior use was stronger than Thornton had anticipated. But the well-digger knew legal arguments alone wouldn't suffice. What mattered was the practical solution he'd been developing, not just winning this battle, but preventing future ones. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the judge directly during his testimony, "the real issue isn't who has prior rights, but how to ensure adequate water for all legitimate uses. I propose a demonstration." The judge raised an eyebrow. "This is a courtroom, not a laboratory." "With respect, sir, water law, without understanding water itself, is like navigation without understanding stars. Give me 1 hour at the Hartley well, and I'll show you something that makes this entire conflict unnecessary." Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps exhaustion from 2 days of legal arguments, but the judge agreed. The entire courtroom relocated to the Hartley farm, creating a bizarre procession of lawyers, farmers, townspeople, and one federal judge in his black robes looking distinctly out of place against the prairie backdrop. At the well site, the well digger had prepared his demonstration with the help of the cooperative. Multiple wells were represented, shallow ones that had failed, the new deep wells, and his special innovation, a cistern system that collected and stored rainwater, filtered through sand and gravel. The average rainfall in this valley is 18 inches per year, he explained, showing his calculations on a board they'd set up. That's nearly 13,000 gallons per acre. But we let most of it run off or evaporate. He demonstrated the cistern system, showing how roof collection, ground catchment, and careful storage could provide water even during drought periods. Then he revealed the deeper innovation, an interconnected system where excess water from wet periods could be stored and shared during dry times. Mr. Thornton's ranch needs water for thousands of cattle, he continued. The farmers need water for crops and household use. The town needs reliable supply for growth. There's enough for all if we manage it wisely instead of fighting over it. Thornton stood apart from the crowd, his expression unreadable. His lawyers whispered urgently to him, but he waved them silent, watching the demonstration with what looked like genuine interest. The well digger pulled up water from the deep well, clear and cold, testing it publicly for purity. Then he showed water from the contaminated shallow wells, demonstrating the salt content that made it unusable. Finally, he presented his masterstroke, a map showing how a valley-wide water management system could work, with Thornton's ranch as a key participant rather than competitor. You're suggesting Thornton should cooperate with these people? One of his lawyers asked incredulously. I'm suggesting everyone benefits from healthy neighbors, the well digger replied. Diseased cattle from bad water don't respect property lines. Failed farms mean no local grain for feed, no workers for seasonal labor, no community to support the services even a large ranch requires. The judge had removed his robes in the heat, standing now in shirt sleeves like any other observer. This is all very interesting, but what about the legal question of water rights? It was Webb who answered, stepping forward with a document case. Your Honor, I've been in communication with the Federal Department of Agriculture. They're prepared to designate this valley as a water conservation district under the new CARI Act provisions. Federal support for infrastructure, but local control of management. The well digger saw Thornton's calculation change. Federal involvement meant oversight, but also funding. A conservation district meant structured rules, but also protected status. It was a compromise that gave everyone something, while taking away no one's essential needs. I need to think, the judge announced. Court will reconvene tomorrow morning. That evening, an unexpected visitor came to the well digger's boarding house room. Thornton himself, alone, looking older than his 58 years. You've won, he said simply, sitting uninvited in the single chair. Have I? You still own the largest ranch, the most cattle, the greatest influence? But not the water monopoly I planned. Thornton's smile was rueful. 20 years I've been building toward controlling this entire valley. You undid it in 2 months. You undid yourself, the well digger replied. The moment you chose poisoning over negotiation, you created the resistance that defeated you. They sat in silence for a moment, two men who understood each other perhaps better than either liked. Finally, Thornton spoke again. Your conservation district idea, would I have a place in it? Every landowner would.
Equal voice based on acreage and water use, but equal nonetheless. The federal agent, Webb, he has evidence to prosecute me. He has evidence of your crimes. What he does with it depends partly on what you do next. Thornton stood to leave, then paused at the door. I came west to build something lasting. Perhaps I chose the wrong methods. It's not too late to choose different ones. The next morning brought surprising news. Before court reconvened, Thornton's lawyers announced their client was withdrawing all water rights claims and would support the formation of the Valley Water Conservation District. More shocking, Thornton himself pledged $50,000, a fortune, toward construction of the valley-wide water management system. The judge, clearly relieved to avoid a complex ruling, approved the Conservation District formation and dismissed all competing claims.
The courtroom erupted in surprised celebration, though the well-digger noticed Webb's expression remained carefully neutral. The deputy still had decisions to make about prosecution. Outside the courthouse, as families discussed this unexpected turn, Clara Morrison approached the well-digger. You gave him a way out that let him keep his dignity. Men like Thornton need to feel they're choosing their fate, not having it forced upon them. This way, he becomes part of the solution. And his crimes? My husband's death? The well-digger met her steady gaze. The dead deserve justice, but the living need water. Sometimes we have to choose which serves the greater good. She nodded slowly, understanding, if not entirely accepting. Robert would have wanted the community to thrive. That matters more than revenge. Young Tommy Hartley ran up, excited by the celebration. Does this mean you'll stay and teach me more about finding water? The well-digger looked around at the gathered faces. The Hartleys, the Perkins brothers, the Schultz family, Joseph Two Rivers nodding approvingly from the shade, Deputy Webb discussing implementation details with Patterson. Even Thornton, standing apart but no longer in opposition, represented a kind of victory. I'll stay through autumn, he promised, long enough to see the Conservation District properly established and train others in the deep well technique. It wasn't the dramatic conclusion that frontier stories usually demanded. No shootout, no villain driven from town, no hero riding into the sunset. Instead, it was something more complex and perhaps more valuable. A community choosing cooperation over conflict, shared wisdom over individual greed. That evening, as the well-digger supervised the beginning of the third cooperative well, he reflected on how water always found its way. Through rock, around obstacles, joining with other streams until it became something stronger than any single source. April of 1895 brought the well-digger back to Red Clay Valley after 6 months of winter travels. The stage road was muddy from spring rains, but that itself was a good sign. Moisture for the land, replenishment for the aquifers, proof that the Earth's cycles continued regardless of human schemes. The valley had transformed in his absence, though perhaps transformed was too strong a word. Rather, it had settled into new patterns, like water finding its level after disturbance. The town showed signs of modest growth, a new lumberyard, the framework of what would become a school, gardens already showing green behind freshly painted fences. Clara Morrison's store remained the community's heart, and she greeted him with something approaching warmth, a significant evolution from their first meeting. Her ledgers now included water cooperative accounts, and she'd become the unofficial recorder of the district's formation. You came back, she observed, not quite making it a question. I said I would check on the wells come spring. A man's only as good as his word. Webb will want to see you. He's got news about the federal case." The well-digger found Deputy Webb, now properly Marshal Webb, the federal promotion having come through, at his office, looking older than his 29 years, but carrying his authority with earned confidence. "The prosecution was settled out of court," Webb explained. "Thornton paid substantial fines. His foreman Brooks got 2 years in federal prison, and the Circle T is under federal oversight for 5 years. And Thornton himself, cooperating fully with the Conservation District. Strange to say, but he's become one of its most effective advocates. His money and influence have brought in federal engineers, modern equipment. The man who poisoned wells is now funding their protection." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Justice had taken an unexpected form, but perhaps a more useful one than imprisonment would have provided. At the Hartley farm, the well-digger found a thriving operation. The deep well he'd dug still produced clear, cold water, and the cistern system had collected thousands of gallons from winter snow and spring rain. Samuel Hartley had added 10 acres of wheat, and Mary had started a vegetable garden that was already showing promise. Young Tommy, now 9, ran to greet him with barely contained excitement. "I've been practicing finding water. Found a spring on the Perkins land nobody knew about." The boy demonstrated his technique with a hazel rod, and the well-digger noted with amusement and approval that Tommy barely relied on it, instead watching the land's subtle signs, where vegetation grew greener, where morning dew lingered, where the earth showed the particular coloration that suggested underground flow. "You've been teaching him well," he told Samuel. "He mostly taught himself once you showed him what to look for. Boy's got the gift." That evening, the community held a gathering at the Methodist Church, not for crisis this time, but for celebration. The Conservation District's first annual meeting, they called it, though it was really an excuse for neighbors to share food and news after the long winter. Thornton attended, keeping to the edges but no longer shunned. The well-digger watched him interact carefully with other landowners, the calculation still there, but tempered by something that might have been genuine respect. When their eyes met, Thornton raised his glass slightly, acknowledgement between former adversaries who'd found unexpected common ground. Joseph Two Rivers, now 72 but still vital, sat with the well-digger as darkness settled over the valley. "You did more than find water," the old man said. "You found the thing that runs deeper, the understanding that we all drink from the same source. It was always there. Sometimes it just takes crisis to make people see it. And sometimes it takes someone from outside to show what insiders have forgotten." Joseph smiled. "You'll leave again soon." It wasn't a question, and the well-digger didn't deny it. "There are other valleys, other towns that need wells. It's what I do. It's what you choose to do. There's a difference." The next morning, the well-digger made his rounds, checking each of the cooperative wells, testing water quality, observing the mechanical systems. Everything functioned as designed, but more importantly, the people operating them understood the principles involved. They weren't dependent on his expertise anymore. At the third well, he encountered an unexpected gathering. Several families from the eastern edge of the valley, newcomers who'd heard about the Conservation District and wanted to join. They peppered him with questions about water table depths, soil percolation rates, the cost of deep drilling versus shallow wells. "Tommy can help you with the initial survey," he suggested, and saw the boy's chest swell with pride. He knows this valley's water better than most. Later, walking through town, he stopped at a new establishment, a small cafe run by the Henderson family, the freed slaves who'd been falsely accused of rustling. Their business was thriving, supported by a community that had learned the cost of scapegoating the vulnerable. "You helped save our reputation," Mrs. Henderson said, serving him coffee and cornbread. "Deputy Webb told us how you questioned those rustling charges." "Marshal Webb saved your reputation. I just asked obvious questions." As his final day in the valley approached, the well digger found himself at the original contamination site on Willow Creek. The spring flow had cleared it of salt, and vegetation was returning to the banks. Nature had its own way of healing, given time and the cessation of harm. Patterson from the land office found him there. "I've been thinking," the formerly nervous clerk said. "Other valleys in the territory face similar problems. Water rights disputes, contamination, drought. The conservation district model could work elsewhere." "It could, with the right people to implement it. I've applied for a position with the Territorial Water Commission. If I get it, I'll need advisors who understand both the technical and human sides of water management." The well digger smiled. "You'll do well. You've learned that water problems are really people problems in disguise." His last evening was spent quietly at the boarding house, packing his few belongings, cleaning and oiling his tools. The German widow who ran the place actually spoke to him, a full sentence in accented English about hoping he'd return someday. Progress came in many forms. At dawn, he stood by the stage stop with his worn leather satchel and wooden tool case. A small crowd had gathered to see him off. The Hartleys, Clara Morrison, Marshal Webb, even Joseph Two Rivers, who pressed a small pottery bowl into his hands. "For holding water from new wells," Joseph said simply. Tommy Hartley was trying not to cry. "Will you ever come back?" "Maybe, but you don't need me to." You know what to look for now, not just in finding water, but in understanding why water matters. The stage arrived in a cloud of dust and jangling harnesses. As he climbed aboard, the well digger took one last look at Red Clay Valley, the green fields where brown had dominated, the windmills turning lazily above deep wells, the people who'd learned that survival meant more than individual success. As the stage pulled away, he heard Tommy shout, "I'll find water for the whole territory someday!" Perhaps he would, the well digger thought. The boy had learned the most important lesson, that finding water wasn't about the mystical pull of a hazel rod or even the scientific reading of geological signs. It was about understanding that water, like truth, like justice, like community itself, was always there beneath the surface, waiting for someone with the patience and wisdom to dig deep enough to find it. The stage rounded a bend, and Red Clay Valley disappeared behind a rise. Ahead lay other territories, other towns, other thirsts that needed quenching. The well digger settled back, already thinking about the next place where his particular skills might matter. Because water always needed finding, and someone had to do the digging. It was good work, necessary work, the kind that left the world a little better than you found it. And in the end, what more could a man ask from his labors than that? The prairie stretched endless before him, and somewhere beyond the horizon, another well waited to be dug.